the opportunity to introduce you to the next panel. There is hope in prevention because there's a scientific foundation for prevention, so I'm excited to introduce you to our prevention panelists. Ms. Katie Hood is the Chief Executive Officer of One Love Foundation in honor of Yardley Love. Dr. Ernie Jarelis is the Dale McKissick Endowed Professor of Psychology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Dr. Sarah DeGue is a Senior Health Scientist at the Division of Violence Prevention at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And Dr. Jackson Katz is an educator, author, and social theorist, as well as a co-founder of Mentors in Violence Prevention, Gender Violence Prevention Program. So as in the past panel, each of the panelists will take a couple questions, and if time permits, we'll take question and answer. So the first question is, based on your research and experience, what are the key components of effective prevention strategies or programs?
So I had a slide to start with. I am the only non-researcher up here. I run the One Love Foundation, which was started after Yardley Love was killed at the University of Virginia in 2010. I'm a friend of the family originally. No one had any idea she was in an abusive relationship. So we exist today to teach young people about what healthy and unhealthy relationships are as a primary prevention approach so that we can empower a whole front line to understand what they're seeing. Because as was just said, it's actually everywhere. But if you've never been taught to identify it, you really don't know what to do. So over the last 4 years, 4.5, we've been creating films. We think film's super powerful for talking to young people about this issue in a way that they can relate to, understand, connect with. We've worked with, like, if you go to here, you can see we've educated 600,000 kids across the country in the last 4.5 years using film plus peer-to-peer discussion to sort of have an internal realization as they're watching that they've seen this before, and then they get the opportunity to sit in a circle and talk to each other about the film, but usually it also folds into their own lives and their own experiences. Over 100 million have engaged with our content online because we believe we have to meet the kids where they are. They're in classrooms and they're also online. So getting this stuff online and starting these conversations, when we launch a new campaign, we see people tagging their friends because they don't know how to have this conversation face-to-face, but they know their friend needs to see this film. So the idea is very much like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. 30 years ago, drunk driving was ubiquitous. Nobody really thought about tackling that problem. But then through a full-out campaign to change the language, change the conversation, and engage young people and communities in change, they've changed the stats dramatically in 30 years. So if we can make 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men, 1 in 6 women, 1 in 10 men, that's radical change. But it requires total dedication and out-of-the-box thinking, like was just said.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say it's an honor to be here. I think one of the most important things that universities and service academies can do is deliver a clear and consistent message that sexual violence is not acceptable, but this message needs to be repeated and delivered in a variety of ways. And I'm going to elaborate with a couple of examples. Lieutenant General David Morrison, when he was the Army Chief in Australia, he came out with a very clear message about his views on this topic. In a 3-minute video, he looked straight into the camera and said, "Those who think it is okay to behave in a way that demeans or exploits their colleagues have no place in this Army." He went on to say, "If you become aware of any individual degrading another, then show moral courage and take a stand against it." This is an example of strong leadership. We've seen other examples of strong leadership earlier today. It's a very clear message, but messages like this, I think, need to be delivered with consistency. And by consistency, I'm talking about consistency across different people at the organization or people on a college campus, as well as consistency over time. For example, on college campuses, messages like this need to be delivered by not just university presidents and provosts, but coaches, staff, faculty members, as well as student leaders. And not just during student orientation when students are inundated with all sorts of information, and as someone said earlier, just trying to figure out if they're going to make friends here. It needs to be delivered at other points during the first year, as well as during the second year and the third year. Now, there are specific violent prevention programs that I think deliver this message effectively. And I think that having a violence prevention program helps send the message. Many violence prevention programs, they've been evaluated, and they have been found to be effective in changing attitudes or behaviors that can help prevent sexual violence. Some of these are face-to-face training programs, some of them are videos or films, some of them are social marketing campaigns. My advice is become familiar with the different programs that are out there, and in particular the programs that have been evaluated and found to be effective. When you adopt a program, you should evaluate it on your campus or in your organization to make sure it works in your setting. And very importantly, don't just adopt a single program and think that you have the problem solved. No single program has been found to be universally effective. No single program completely eliminates violence. I really think that what we need to start thinking about are more comprehensive efforts where we're stacking different programs, we're adopting multiple programs, and we're figuring out how best to implement it at a university. For example, we should offer something during orientation to help set the tone and to help start to establish an anti-violence culture. But we need to follow that up with other programs or other messaging throughout the whole year and during other years as well. Again, the idea here is we want to send a clear message, we want to repeat that message, and we want to deliver it in a variety of ways. Thank you.
The Division of Violence Prevention at CDC uses the public health approach or model to really address primary prevention or stopping violence before it starts using the best available research evidence. And we strive to both create that evidence and then try to move that evidence out into the field so that communities can pick it up and use what we know works to prevent violence. We do that for all forms of violence. My work has focused most specifically on sexual violence. And in the last couple of years, we've developed two key documents, which are kind of summarized in these graphics here, if you can see them, that I want to highlight for you. And I could talk about these for hours, but I will talk about them for about 2 more minutes. And I can talk to any of you more individually, or you can see these on our website as well if you have more questions. But the first document, Sexual Violence on Campus, was based on think tank meetings that CDC held in 2015, where we brought together college administrators, law enforcement, researchers, and prevention practitioners, students, and others. And we really tried to identify the core tenets of effective prevention on campus for sexual violence. And we came up with these kind of 5 pillars. The first one really echoes what Dr. Durreel's just said, comprehensive prevention. And by comprehensive prevention, we really mean this idea of taking multiple prevention strategies and layering them on top of each other. So it's not just one program that we're expecting to counteract all of the social and cultural and environmental effects that feed into sexual violence over the course of a person's lifetime, but we apply multiple approaches that address risk and protective factors across contexts, over time, from multiple messengers, and where the same messages are repeated and reinforced across these different pieces. So that's one thing that's really important. And again, that's important because we know from our research that these single programs can have some limited effects on both perpetration and victimization over time, but none of them are going to be the silver bullet that we need to address this problem because the causes are so complex. The next piece is on building a prevention infrastructure. And a lot of this is getting well-trained, dedicated staff to address this issue, but it's also about making it a part of everyone's job, really building it into the infrastructure of the campus. So this means that everyone kind of feels that part of their job is to contribute to the work of prevention. Another way you can do that is also by connecting prevention strategies. So sexual violence prevention doesn't need to be a standalone office. They can integrate with mental health, with sexual health, with other forms of violence prevention that might be happening on campus, or substance abuse prevention. So those things can also help integrate it into the infrastructure. The third piece is thinking about the audiences on campus that you need to address. There are, of course, a diverse number of audiences on campus, and they all can't hear the same messages or won't hear the messages from the same messengers the same way. So you really need to talk to students and identify what those subpopulations are and think about crafting messages that students can hear. And someone mentioned parents earlier. A couple of people I think have mentioned parents. Parents can be another important audience in addition to a messenger for your programs and strategies, because parents are still really influential over young people in that age group. The fourth piece, very quickly, is around building key partnerships. Those can be with community-based organizations in the communities that surround our campuses. Even though campuses are kind of distinct, they are, of course, not insulated, and they do interact with the community. So rape crisis centers can be a really helpful resource. And getting buy-in from leadership like yourselves can help create that climate change that we need, and also provide the resources and the infrastructure to create sustainability. And finally, we need to use data to make our decisions. We need to have evaluation research on our programs or strategies that we're implementing to really know if they work or not, and if we should continue to invest in them. Talk about the other one later.
Good job. Thank you, and I'm also honored to be here, and it's a great opportunity. Thank you, both my fellow panelists and the audience. I think that the single most important factor, as far as I'm concerned, if we want to address these issues in a preventive way, is to engage men more effectively, which means we need more leadership from men. We need explicit leadership from men, not gender-neutral discussions like as if we have a problem that's across the board and not overwhelmingly one of men assaulting women and men assaulting other men. Let's just be clear about that. It's not anti-male to say that. It's a factual statement. And if there's no other place in the world, then this is the one place that I can think of that has the most sort of energy around men and leadership, and obviously women's leadership. Let me just say, women's leadership has been transformative. Women's leadership has created the foundation for intellectually, politically, socially, and activist-wise all over the world to address these issues. So this is not in any way saying that men need to take over from women. Women's leadership has been foundational and will continue to be so. The missing piece in our society, on college campuses, in the U.S. military and all the services, with whom I've worked for 21 years, all the services, the missing piece has been men's leadership and explicit leadership from men. I don't mean just men who are in positions of leadership saying, we really care about these issues. I'm saying men explicitly talking about what is the relationship between cultural ideologies about manhood that we instill in our young people from the beginning and the outcomes that we see every single day of sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence. These are worldwide, global problems. Every society has them. We have the resources in this society, we have the leadership potential in this society to do differently and to do better, and we haven't done what we could be doing, to be quite frank about it, because of the lack of leadership from men. That's what my position is. Now, there's so many different ways of going about thinking about this. Yes, some men are going to get defensive in the face of that. This is what happens and has happened in the military, is that there's pushback. Whenever you talk honestly about gender, there's pushback from men. This is in the military, it's in the civilian world. Men will say, well, you're just bashing men, you're anti-male. What about the women who are the perpetrators? And what about, one of the reasons why we need more men to say these things is because we need to push back against that defensive reaction that shuts down forward progress. And if we had more men who are willing to say some of these things that I'm saying in positions of responsible leadership, it would take the pressure off of those women who get called male bashers and anti-male for telling the truth. And if you... And if you notice, in discussions about domestic and sexual violence, whether it's in the United States military or on college campuses, a lot of people dance around the subject matter. They talk with gender-neutral terminology, and I appreciate the reason for that. The reason for that is largely because women have been the ones leading the discussion, and they know that some men get really defensive and hostile in response. So if there's nothing else that I can say about this subject, and obviously I can say a lot, it's that men's leadership will take the pressure off of those women. Last piece of this, for this sort of lightning round that we're doing here, we need to talk intersectionally about these issues, not just because we just can't presume that everybody is homogeneously, racially, and ethnically the same, or gender identity or sexual identity the same, and that's often happens in these kinds of conversations. And so, for example, I'm one of the architects of the bystander approach. You understand the bystander approach is now mainstream, but when we started in 1993, the organization that I created, the Mentors in Violence Prevention Program, the first program in the sports culture, the first program in the military, We intentionally were intersectional from the beginning, which is to say we created space in the pedagogy, which is to say in the training, in the workshops, in the engagement, to talk honestly about race and ethnicity and all the other social categories, because there's real differences between how people respond and how people feel authorized to respond based on their social position. I'll give you one quick example. Men of color, especially in this case, African American men, will often say, I won't intervene if I see a situation, even a potential harm, because if something happens and the law enforcement comes, I'm more likely to be identified as the perpetrator because of the charged racial sort of environment in our country, right? And so they'll say, I'm not going to get involved because it's too risky for me. A lot of white men would never even think about that. It would never even be a consideration. They're worried about losing status in their peer culture. They're worried about guys thinking they're being politically correct or being soft or taking the women's side in the battle between the sexes. A lot of the reasons why white men won't intervene have to do with some of those social dynamics, but men of color have to deal with that, and on the top of that, the burden of the race and racism piece. So that has to be talked about if we want to honestly talk about being, leaders. And the last point, and thank you, is the, I've been frustrated, and you can hear it in my voice, and I've been doing this work for a long time, both on college and university campuses and in the military. What frustrates me is that so much of the discussion has to do with, not just in today, I'm talking about more generally, has to do with sexual assault prevention or sexual harassment prevention as a safety concern while students are in college or university or in the service academies doing their education. We need to keep them safe. I think that's an important goal, but it's way too unambitious, okay? We say that we're trying to train young people for leadership and citizenship and global leadership in the 21st century. The issues of sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence are gigantic problems in our species, and they're global in nature, and they're pervasive. And if we're saying that we're training young people to be citizens of the 21st century, we need to train them in these things on the academic side as well as on the student services side. It's not just a safety issue, it's an educational issue that's broader, and it's a leadership issue fundamentally.
The second question for the panel is, as leaders in your organizations, what do we need to know about the social and environmental factors that influence risk and protection from sexual violence?
I think the number one factor is that these are issues that thrive and grow in the dark. So when no light is shown on them, when nobody's talking about them, they persist and they expand. So one of the reasons I was so excited about this meeting is because it is only by shining light on these issues, by talking honestly about the statistics, and by really just pushing it out into the open, that we're ever going to tackle them. Because Jackson's exactly right. The magnitude of what we need to be aspiring for is far beyond any one curriculum. It's about changing the entire conversation, and not just about the end root problem. It's about getting way ahead of it and saying, I think the most important investment we could make at the K-12 level is in relationship health education all the way through. So every year kids are learning in the same language, that same taxonomy, the same ladder, how to talk to each other, how to have hard conversations, how to help each other. I see through our work, which by the way, we started focused on college because Yardley was in college, and we've worked with both the Naval Academy and West Point, and we're thrilled to have worked with them, but we've worked with schools all over the country, and the first thing college kids said to us was, you need to go younger. So we went to high school, and the next thing high school kids said was, we love this, you need to go younger. And this is not just a female-only discussion. Boys and girls are grateful to have the opportunity to watch movies together, who doesn't like movies, especially this generation, and then to talk about what they saw and relate it to their lives. So it isn't about one, and again, it's not just about a one and done. It's this dosing idea, and we think about dosing very broadly. We think about dosing as the curricula, the Team One Love Club, or whatever club it is, a peer health educator club. I don't actually care that much about One Love being a master of the universe. I just want everybody in this world to know how to talk about these issues and to get rid of the stigma around it. We think about kids now having tools. When somebody says to me, my son told me there was a One Love moment at the party last night. I'm like, hooray, we're giving them a language to understand what they're seeing. It's like putting on a pair of glasses. Once you've been taught what unhealthy is, once you know what healthy is, once you've talked to your friends, there's a whole empowered front line of people that are now able to help, not just in an acute crisis situation, but an everyday conversation. And so you have to think that big. Because if we think too much, what happened in Yarley's situation, it was not sexual assault, but the fact that 84 to 98% of campus sexual assault is committed by an acquaintance means that this root cause issue of relationship health is absolutely vital. And so in her case, the friends were planning an intervention around drinking because they had been educated about drinking. They had never been educated about these issues. So I don't want to oversimplify. I think these are entrenched issues. They're deeply human issues. There is no simple solution. But one huge thing is if we all just start talking about it and talking together and collaborating and sharing data, there is no reason data shouldn't be out there. Because if we keep it away, we're sort of trying to hide what we all know to be true, and that gets in the way of real change.
Our research group has findings indicating that it's really important for students to believe that the university is very serious about preventing sexual violence. If the students do not believe this, otherwise effective violence programming or violence prevention programming, it just doesn't work as well. And I think what university leaders need to recognize are some of the things that undermine this belief that the university is serious about this mission. One thing, and I'm going to state the obvious here, our messaging needs to be backed up by appropriate action. We need to take reports of sexual violence very seriously. Reports need to be followed up with swift and professional actions, and students need to be made aware of this. Students need to know that sexual violence reports are taken seriously. A second thing, and I think that this is less obvious to some, but violence prevention efforts at universities cannot just involve our staff that are in student affairs and the students. It really has to involve the entire university. This would be faculty and other staff members that are not student affairs staff. And ideally, what we have are faculty getting other faculty on board, and other staff are getting other staff on board. At universities, I think we all want a culture where students feel like they're being treated fairly and that they're being treated equally. I talk with faculty at a lot of different universities. I talk with students at a lot of different universities. And what I'm told is that faculty sometimes are undermining university efforts at getting students to feel equal. This is not done purposely, necessarily. It's really through insensitive behavior. They talk about classroom discussions where females are interrupted more so than males. They talk about classrooms where males are called upon more often than females. I hear about sexual orientation jokes. I hear about faculty that are committing microaggressions. And these actions, they send messages. They send messages that some groups of students are less respected than others. So again, I think that if we're really going to tackle this effort, it's going to need to involve more than our student affairs group. It needs to involve more than just the students. We really need to engage the faculty. We need to engage other staff members in the effort as well. I'll stop there.
Before I address that question, I want to put a plug in quickly for the second document that CDC published in the last few years, which really what we call a technical package, but it's essentially a summary of the best available research evidence to prevent sexual violence to date. And what we did was sort of look at decades of research and on prevention practice and try to identify 5 core strategies that have that best available research evidence that we intend not to be sort of a pick list where you need one thing from each of these categories, but to give communities a focus for their effort for their resources, for their thinking around building these comprehensive prevention strategies, so that we can begin to see what it would look like to have these multi-level, multi-component strategies that address risk and protective factors across the social ecology. And the 5 kind of core strategies that we identified involve promoting social norms that protect against violence, teaching skills to prevent violence, and this most often does apply to younger people. And most of our work is focused on middle and high school in this area. providing opportunities to empower and support girls and women, creating protective environments, and supporting survivors to lessen harms. So I just wanted to point out that we have this guidance document that really is a summary of what's available, what we know works to date, and it can be a good touch point for colleges, for communities, for military academies to think about where to start with this work. And there are copies in the hallway on this side. So to address the second question, we really have a lot of work left to do in terms of research on social and cultural and environmental factors that affect sexual violence. It's one of the areas where we still have a lot of gaps. But I think it's worth pointing out some really unique characteristics of the college environment that can contribute to risk in unique ways and also present a lot of unique opportunities for prevention on campus. So college campuses, of course, have a high concentration of young adults, which is the highest risk age group for sexual violence, perpetration, and victimization. There's a cultural expectation for high-risk behavior, drinking, sexual behavior, that contributes to risk. There's an exposure to higher-risk living arrangements like student housing or higher-risk social groups like Greek life or athletic groups. And there's also, I think, in terms of a potential opportunity, a really strong, typically social or cultural identity associated with the college. A lot of us still identify strongly with our undergraduate institutions where we went, even though it may have been many years since we were there, right? So that you can capitalize on these things to help engage people in learning new norms and changing them into positive ones associated with that identity. Another opportunity that doesn't exist in our general communities is that the college controls the curricula and controls the policies. There typically isn't a lot of work that needs to happen, well, I'm sure there's work, but there aren't a lot of barriers to changing those policies beyond the college. And so there are a lot of opportunities to make decisions that communities can struggle with. There's also a defined and contained physical environment, which can be both a risk or a potential opportunity. And then there are two other unique aspects that are worth noting. There's sort of this recognized socio-legal responsibility for student safety when you're on college campuses. When you send your kid to college, you expect that the college is focused on keeping them safe. And there are also federal mandates going along with that for prevention and education opportunities. So I think these are kind of unique aspects of the college environment and social structure that can present some risk, but that colleges really need to think about in terms of opportunities they can leverage, ways that it could potentially be actually easier to do prevention in that kind of environment than in a general community where it's more difficult to control all of these factors. So just wanted to point that out, but we do still have a lot of work to do in that area.
Thank you. Well, reflective of my earlier comments, I think the norms that have to be addressed are gender norms, period, end of sentence. The most important norms that have to be examined are how we define manhood and womanhood in our society, how boys and men are socialized, how certain kinds of behaviors are normalized in male culture. We have to talk about, for example, the role of pornography in the socialization of boys, heterosexual boys. Heterosexual boys are sexualized through porn by overwhelmingly more so porn than any other form of quote-unquote sex education, but it's really sex miseducation because they're not learning healthy sexuality through their consumption of pornography. So that's an example, for example, of a norm, a gendered norm that's shaped early on and that we're, I think, naive to think we can solve the problem of sexual harassment and sexual assault while not talking about, for example, porn and other forms of media and how they shape certain kind of expectations and ideologies about, manhood and heterosexuality and such like that. And it's not easy topic matter. This is one of the reasons why people go away from it, because it's uncomfortable and because people have personal differences and there's morality versus, questions about morality and such. I think one of the most promising approaches to thinking about porn is thinking about it as a public health crisis of the digital age. It's harmful not just to women and girls, but also to men and boys' healthy sexuality. So that's an example of a norm that needs to be examined critically. I think that we need to have leadership training, by the way, in one of the things about college campuses and the service academies and the military more generally is you have cohesive groups, right? Cohesive groups like in a military unit, a sports team, a fraternity, and I'm using the men's piece on here. I know there's sororities, there's women's leadership, so I don't mean to exclude that, but I think that the focus needs to be brought to the the attention needs to be brought to the male culture and how boys and men are socialized. But this dynamics within these cohesive groups. The reason why boys and men don't intervene, for example, when they see other men acting in various ways is not because they don't know what to do. It's not about skill building. I think skill building is important, but it's they don't feel like they have the permission to speak up because they've been policed into conformist silence with certain norms that have been defined within those groups. And if they see that if they're going to speak out, it's going to cause them to lose status within that group, and they have pretensions towards leadership in that group, and they go against the group. This is the odd thing about what leadership means. Leadership means taking risks, and yet this means taking a risk. A young man at any of the service academies or on a college campus who sees friends of his acting in certain ways that he sees as inappropriate, who says something to those men, has to have the self-confidence to do that because he's going to get policed into silence if he doesn't have the confidence to stand up and say, I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do. You can't talk like that about women. You can't treat girls and women like that. I'm not going to stand by while you do this. You have to have real self-confidence to do that. And let's not kid ourselves. 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 21. I was a confident young guy, and I was scared of young men in my peer group. And I was a really big football, accomplished football player. So men, including men who are in the military, who I respect, who have strong leadership capabilities, when it comes to these issues, a lot of those guys don't want to be seen as soft or weak or wimps or what have you. There's all kinds of strategies we've developed, many of us in this work, especially the men who are doing the work, building on women's leadership, have figured a lot of this out years and decades ago. My last point here. We figured this out decades ago. The biggest problems that I face in my work, whether it's in the military, on college campuses, in the corporate world, is not pedagogical. It's not about what do you say to young men? How do you frame these issues in a way that they can embrace? We figured that out decades ago. I'm sorry. The most difficult questions are political questions. How do you get into systems? How do you get the buy-in of leadership? How do you get men in positions of leadership to partner with women and stand with them as their partners and allies? Those are the hard questions. And then one of the things that the military, and I'm really happy we're in a military setting because I've valued greatly my work in the U.S. military for many, many years now. One of the benefits of an institution like the military that's so much about leadership is if there is strong leadership at all levels, then you can change culture much more quickly. And so on college campuses, last comment, on college campuses we need, I think, and I'm editorializing here, but we need leadership training for all captains and co-captains of athletic teams. We need leadership training for all Greek letter officers. We need, and I mean not just 1 hour filing into an auditorium with the rest of your fraternity brothers, with the rest of your student athletes, and swipe your card and get credit for doing sexual assault prevention for this semester because you listen to someone like me give a speech, or you listen to a theater troupe do a bystander intervention program. You need leadership training specifically on gender violence prevention for all Greek leaders, for all athletic captains, for all heads of student organizations, for all ROTC, for all the leadership infrastructure that's already on campus and in the service academies, but you've got to build in organically gender violence prevention as part of your leadership portfolio, or we're failing to do the kind of training and provide our young people with the kind of training that they need to be strong leaders on these very difficult issues.
Thank you. So, we'll take one question. Yeah, we'll take one question, and then we did cut the question and answer a bit short, which is an understatement on this session, but do seek out these individuals if you have questions or want to continue the dialogue. Dr. Malmuth?
In theory, I agree with everything that's been said, but we've been talking about data, and I want to point two pieces of data that from my reading of the literature I believe are correct, and please tell me if I'm wrong. One, in contrast to what the impression has been given so far, I think as the CDC report indicates, on college campuses, none of the prevention programs except for bystander interventions have been shown to work. Secondly, none of the programs evaluate individual differences by looking at high-risk males who we are most concerned about versus others. And even the effects that show zero effects of intervention may mask the fact that the high-risk males perhaps are becoming more hostile, whereas the low-risk people are indeed changing in the direction, and therefore they cancel each other out. But none of the interventions really look at that, despite the fact that it was suggested that we should be looking at individual differences. So where am I wrong, and did I misread the CDC report or the literature in general?
Well, I can address the CDC report. So there are two reports. One is a lit review that I wrote a few years ago, which did find that at the college level, the only programs that had rigorous levels of effective evidence in colleges were bystander-based programs. Although there are a number of other strategies that were tested in high schools or other settings that had some evidence as well. The challenge is really not that, what I would say about that is not that we only think bystander strategies are effective, but it really goes to the lack of rigorous evidence in the way that those programs are tested on college campuses and often elsewhere as well. So what we're really lacking is a sufficient amount of evidence to test those other kinds of strategies. In the technical package that I mentioned later, we looked more broadly, not at just that most rigorous kind of evidence, randomized controlled trials, where we're looking only at perpetration and victimization outcomes like we did in the literature review, but we looked a little bit more broadly at promising strategies as well, and of course we looked beyond colleges at strategies that were tested in a lot of different environments, and we did it in that report then identify a much broader set of approaches that do have some promising or effective evidence in different contexts. And so it's not, definitely, I would not say that bystander strategies are the only effective strategies on college campuses. It's just that we have such limited or in some cases poor quality evidence at the college level that we don't know if those other strategies work to the level that we can, and I'm sure that many of those other strategies do work. It's just that we don't have the evidence to support that at that point. So what we really need is investment in strong research evidence that can really tell us which of these programs or which of these strategies are going to be the most effective. And then in terms of your question about the high-risk populations, I completely agree with that. I think your study looking at the effects of bystander strategies was on high-risk men and the potential iatrogenic effects of that. That's a really important thing that we need to keep looking at. The way that the research has been done to date makes it very hard for us to often have the power to parse that out and understand the effects on different subpopulations, but I think that is actually part of our research agenda at CDC, is to continue to try to move forward the evidence so that we can look at that more closely, and I think there's a reason to believe that some of these strategies could work differently for different people or not work at all.
So fortunately, we have a formation that we want to make sure folks can get to, so we do have to do a hard stop at this point, but please continue some of these discussions in the breakout groups. Can you join me in thanking our panel?